think it's the same thing with the abortion issue. If we just talk about these laws that are being passed and not the babies and the women affected by them, people can kind of separate themselves from the situation, and it's easier to ignore who's actually being affected.
So last time I brought in Leah Savas to talk about abortion and how it's covered in the news, and it was a really good interview, a long interview, so I split it up into two. So here is part 2 of that interview. I might be totally ignorant here, but it would seem that most popular mainstream media outlets almost have a consensus on how they talk about these things. The verbiage that they use and the way that they talk about different parties involved. Is there a general consensus? Is something going on in the higher ups? What do you know about that?
Yeah. Well, and I'm actually going to start with one where this mainstream outlet surprised me by covering this issue of abortion in a very balanced way. And this is from the Washington Post. Back in 2021, they published a very long, I can't remember how many words, but it was a very long kind of feature profiling this pro-life woman in Texas who wanted to start a maternity ranch. So basically like this place where women who are pregnant but struggling can come to find support and help and spiritual nourishment as well. And the reporter, I actually ended up interviewing her later, just asking her some questions about her story. She said her goal was just to accurately represent this woman's views, to describe her worldview, describe her life and her world and kind of her motivations. And it turned out to be a very flattering picture of this woman who is a believer. She's involved in her church. She has a strong desire to serve those in need. And that really came through in the story. And the funny thing is, though, that the response to the story, some people were very angry about how, I guess, how balanced the story was, how it actually made this woman look like she was a genuine believer, just a good person who's trying to serve others. Some people called it a disaster of a story. They talked about it as irresponsible journalism, or just that it was horrific. They're using like these very strong terms. And then there's this one very, very liberal outlet called Slate. They ran an editorial about the piece. And I'll just read to you a little part from it. But the writer Dahlia Lithwick, she said that it's an example of, quote, what can go wrong when a publication apparently believes there are two sides to human rights atrocities and rape. So basically she's talking about pro-life views as if they're the same thing as a human atrocity or rape. She's equating these views with those horrific human realities. And I think that's normally how a lot of pro-abortion outlets or just mainstream outlets view the abortion issue and view pro-life policies. And then contrasting that with some other articles that I've come across in the last couple of years showing how these writers just didn't do a good job of asking questions about the motivations of the people that they're reporting on. So in October 2022, there's this Guardian article that ran pictures of basically the tissue removed in an abortion. And they presented it as being, this is what you'll see if you have an abortion. This is what comes out when we perform the abortion procedure. And it's just this white tissue in little petri dishes, all clean looking, very nice looking. And they're trying to contrast this with the pictures of aborted babies that some pro-lifers use to kind of expose the horror of abortion. Now, there's a lot of backlash to this. Like women who had had miscarriages at those same stages of pregnancy sent pictures in and like shared pictures publicly of their miscarried babies, showing, look, no, you can actually see this little human. It's not just some white blob of tissue, which it seems like the tissue that they were showing in the Guardian article was actually just the gestational sac with the baby removed. It's not clear to me exactly what happened, but it seems like they just took the baby out. So it was just interesting too, because they failed to ask the question, what's the motivation of this this group that is providing us these pictures. It turns out the group that was giving them these pictures is actually a group of abortion providers.
Oh, there's a big surprise!
So they have probably potentially financial reasons for wanting people to see these pictures, so that they think, oh, abortion's not bad. It doesn't end a little life. It's just a clump of tissue that we're taking out. So that was just another example that came through. Someone posted on Instagram pictures that the Guardian ran a few years before of unborn babies, like very lifelike pictures of them in gestational sacs. You can see the little babies in there, and then here they are a few years later running this article showing these blobs of white tissue taking the baby out of the picture. So yeah, it's very interesting that they made that switch just within a few years.
I think as journalists, we can agree that the questions you do ask are as important as the questions you don't ask. So what kind of questions are they not asking?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that I pointed out is just how they're not looking for the real motives of the people that they're reporting on. They're not, especially for the pro-life side, like that Washington Post article, the reporter did a great job of just seeking to understand the perspective of this pro-life woman she was reporting on. So just failing to ask those questions, failing to really even give the other side of the issue the time of day, I think is something that they're just not doing well. But also, they're failing to ask questions, even like with the Guardian article. Not just did they fail to ask what the motives could be of this group that was providing them these photos, but they also aren't asking, what's going on even at the very earliest stages when an unborn baby is just like 200 or 300 cells inside of the mother and there's no distinguishable features. Well, what's going on in those cells? It's not just pond scum. Like, there's an obvious difference between this little 200, 300 cell human and pond scum. And the difference is that this human has human DNA and is growing into an adult human. So those are some questions that just don't show up too often in mainstream media.
So what goes on in the higher management or oversight of these places? Is it a general consensus to cover abortion this way?
Well, I do think that there is, in just modern America, there's a very self-centered worldview, where people in general just are okay with things like abortion as long as that allows someone to do what they want or to pursue their dreams. I think there's just an acceptance and a hardness of heart towards the vulnerable among us, so the unborn babies. So, but as far as individual news outlets, I guess I can't speak to exactly what's going on with the leadership. But I do know from, for instance, if you follow the Associated Press style guides, they'll release updates every once in a while on how you should talk about certain issues. And one of them recently was abortion. They released a topical guide in 2022, and it makes it has a list of recommendations for how to cover the abortion issue. For instance, it advised using the term provide instead of perform an abortion, which obviously that provides, it seems more medical, like a healthcare thing, as opposed to perform abortion, where you could also, I guess you could perform terrible things too, but you don't normally describe that as providing. It also advised using the term anti-abortion counseling centers instead of pregnancy resource centers, because they see the focus of pro-life pregnancy centers as just talking women out of getting abortion, when in reality these centers want to provide women with other resources so they know that they have options. And then, and also, this is one that we hear a lot, but the Associated Press advised against using the term heartbeat and said that you should use cardiac activity because heartbeat is, well, I guess in some ways it's too personal, or they also say that it's unscientific because there's no heart at that stage, although what is cardiac activity? What is cardiac arrest? That's when you when you have a heart attack. So it just seems like they're nitpicking just to kind of separate the reader from the unborn baby in a way.
So one difference I'm noticing here is that you tend to cover the stories of women and babies instead of dealing with the higher level concepts. Why is that important to tell stories instead of just dealing with, the higher level concepts?
The stories of individuals are a lot more interesting to read. So just starting from a very basic level there, before I was in this job, I did not read the news because I thought it was boring. But I did like stories about people. And I think that's a pretty common thing among readers. Like, they'd rather read something about another face, another actual human, instead of just concepts or laws or politics, although that is also essential and some people find it interesting. But I think one good example of why it's important to stay street level and stay very fundamental and personal in your reporting is because it drives more responses from readers. Like, it's motivating to readers. And I think it's the same thing with the abortion issue. If we just talk about these laws that are being passed and not the babies and the women affected by them, people can kind of separate themselves from the situation, and it's easier to ignore who's actually being affected. So a good example of this is actually back in the 1840s in New York City. There was this notorious abortionist. Her name was Madame Restell, and she was performing abortions illegally in New York City. But she was paying off all the police officers. Like, she had all these connections high up in the city and was getting away with it. So it wasn't until one newspaper actually started to call her out that people started to call on their local authorities to enforce the laws against her. A lot of other newspapers were making money off of abortion ads, but this one newspaper refused to run abortion ads, and they ran stories describing things like aborted babies, once they're out, just kind of kicking in a tub, as they're dying. So, like, these very vivid images drove people to protest Madame Restell and call on the police to arrest her. She went on trial, and she actually ended up in prison for a short time because of that activism, which was fueled by these reports from this one newspaper.
You and your husband are expecting, and is it May or July? July.
Yeah.
Okay. So what kind of perspective has that given you in terms of your reporting regarding pregnancy and unborn life?
It's been kind of hard in some ways because if I'm not writing about abortion, I'm writing about a really complicated pregnancy. So it's a temptation to worry, like, oh, I remember I just wrote about this one lady who had this thing happen at this stage of pregnancy. I'm like, I hope my baby's okay. I hope I'm okay. So it's a real temptation to worry just because I kind of know the worst case scenario. But also a good opportunity to just trust the Lord with whatever happens and recognize that He loves this baby and knows this baby more than me or my husband. Like, He is the one that is knitting this baby together. So that's been a big comfort to kind of contemplate that in times of worry. But I also think just the abortion issue has gotten more sad and more real since becoming pregnant, just because, at various stages in the pregnancy, I'll think, oh, like, before 10 weeks, I thought multiple times, wow, I could still legally take an abortion pill here in Michigan and abort this baby at this stage, um, or even at 15 weeks, there are some just pro-life groups and politicians kind of trying to come around a 15-week protection for unborn babies, which means before that they could still be aborted. And so at my 14-week ultrasound, I was, looking at this baby moving around on the screen, laying on his tummy. We don't know if it's a he or she, but laying on his tummy, moving onto his back, moving his arms. And I thought, wow, this is, even under that law, this baby could still legally be killed. So that's been kind of sobering to me, just seeing just how alive this baby is, and how these laws are discounting that baby's right to live. But it's also been convicting to me because I have seen my own selfishness come out in this pregnancy, where there are lists of things that you shouldn't eat if you're pregnant, and I'm, especially around Thanksgiving and Christmas, I had these moments of like, I always get to eat such and such. Like, it's not fair that I can't have that now. But I mean, how selfish. Like, I have the opportunity to grow this little human inside of me. Why should I be thinking about myself and my own preferences in that time? But I think that's really what happens in the whole abortion issue. People considering themselves over their unborn neighbor, which is their own child. So it's been convicting, but also like seeing the evil in myself as well as seeing the evil in the world. I think it's been kind of a both and thing, but also a good reminder to continue trusting the Lord with this baby and enjoy this time. Like, what a privilege to be able to have a little baby growing inside of me. It's been really cool.
And once you're allowed to, what's the first thing you're going to eat?
That's a good question. I think homemade ice cream, because I make homemade ice cream quite frequently, and it has raw eggs in it. So I have made it at least once pasteurized since getting pregnant. Like, I found a way online that said you can do this to like pasteurize the eggs. So it's not like I can't eat it. It just takes a little longer to make. And then I think lunch meat, even though I'm not a huge lunch meat gal anyway, it's been hard to have to say no, or even think about going to Subway and realizing, oh, I couldn't have it. So I'm excited to have those. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Caleb Bailey. I'm a reporter with World Watch News, and we are a daily educational news program for students. Our team tackles current events and human interest stories all in one, while hopefully not leaving you stressed out. Along with these videos on YouTube, we have a full 10-minute show. And if you go to worldwatch.news/YouTube24 and use the code YouTube24, that's all caps YouTube24, you'll get the first month for free. So if you like what we're doing here, try out our full news program. 10 minutes, 5 days a week. Just use the link in the code and we'll see you over there. Thanks for watching.